Welcome to another episode of Honest Reviews. With the recent news of Doom and Rise of the Tomb Raider having been, quote, cracked, it's the perfect time to open a discussion on the problems surrounding DRM as a whole. Note that there are conflicting reports on whether the term cracked should be used here, as it seems it may just be a workaround. At the time of this recording, however, the only sources of information are all unofficial, so it's difficult to say. But for now, let's just go with the term workaround. So, what is Denuvo? Well, it's a form of DRM, or digital rights management. Nobody truly knows how it works, though the Chinese cracking group 3DM claims that it's a program that constantly encrypts and decrypts itself using the Denuvo servers in a fashion that is unique to each machine that it's installed on. So that way it's, quote, impossible to crack. When some users were concerned that the encryption-decryption process would shorten the lifespan of a solid-state drive, Denuvo Software Solutions, the company that made the program, made a public statement saying, quote, Denuvo anti-tamper does not constantly read or write any data to storage media, unquote, which obviously implies that the process is entirely based on the Denuvo servers, which is why people are upset with the system in general. Which brings us to the heated topic of whether or not Denuvo should be used. Denuvo claims that because the games they protect can never be cracked by pirates, that their sales will increase. Evidence suggests otherwise, however. If you take a look at sales worldwide for games using Denuvo versus games that don't, you start to see a clearer picture. In March of 2016, CD Projekt Red reported that The Witcher 3 had sold nearly 10 million copies worldwide. The Witcher 3 does not use a DRM software. Compare that to the recent release of the newest Doom game, which does use DRM. No official statements have been released as to the magnitude of sales for that game, but using reliable game sales trackers online, we can get a pretty decent idea for how many units were sold. Adding up PC, PS4, and Xbox One sales, we come to a whopping 1.61 million copies sold, which comes out to about 16% of sales when compared to The Witcher 3. Now obviously Denuvo didn't cause Doom to sell far less than The Witcher 3 did. Correlation does not equal causation, but that doesn't mean we can't rule out the impact that Denuvo would have here. You have two games, one that is completely crackable as it has absolutely zero DRM on it, and one that is completely uncrackable, with the crackable one selling over 5 times the number of units. Looking at these numbers, it's difficult to make the argument that games that can be pirated sell less copies than games that can't be pirated. So what's the problem, you might be asking yourself? Who cares if they put DRM on games? As long as I pay for the game legit, it doesn't affect me. It only affects pirates. Wrong. It does affect you. And instead of trying to explain it, I'm just going to show you an example of where DRM has failed the consumer. Ever heard of the game Darkspore? To be honest, neither had I until I learned about its shutdown. Darkspore was a game that borrowed creature editing aspects from the game Spore. You would create a monster using different limbs, colors, weapons, etc., and then go out into the world and kill other monsters with it. It was a pretty niche market, and I personally don't ever remember seeing any advertising for it, so the game's sales were pretty dismal. But the reason I bring it up is because in order to play the single-player aspect of the game, you needed to maintain an internet connection with EA's servers. You see, the developers thought it would be a good idea to build the entire game around having a constant internet connection in order to play. The idea being that you can't pirate the game if a majority of the actual programming is handled entirely by EA's servers. So if you didn't own the game, and thus didn't have access to their servers, you'd have an incomplete version that was unplayable. What could go wrong? You see, the game didn't do so well when it came to making money. Maintaining servers costs money, so you need to have an inflow of cash in order to make up for that cost. EA decided it wasn't making enough money on game sales, so they cut the project entirely. What does this mean for people who bought the game? It means it's literally unplayable. Because EA shut down their servers, you can't even play the single-player portion of the game that you purchased. If you try to access Darkspore from your Origin account, you're greeted by a message that says your game license has expired. That's right, your game license has expired. You see, you never actually bought the rights to that game. You only bought a temporary pass to be allowed to play it, or at least according to EA anyway. So how does this correlate with Denuvo, you might ask? If the Denuvo servers ever go down in the future, every game that they protect will be completely unplayable. But Denuvo will never go bankrupt, you might say. They can't be cracked, so people will always buy their software. They have no reason to shut down their servers. Wrong. GameSpy said the same thing. If you're not sure what that is, it was an anti-cheat software used heavily in the early 2000s by games like Company of Heroes and Battlefield. GameSpy went bankrupt, and every single game that they, quote, protected was no longer able to be played. The difference between GameSpy and Denuvo, though, is GameSpy only covered online play, where Denuvo covers both online and offline. So you see, the chances of your new Doom game being playable in 10 to 20 years is slim to none, especially considering Denuvo has recently been, quote, cracked. If their protection software has been compromised, then companies will no longer pay for their protection. If Denuvo isn't making money, their servers going down is only a matter of if and not when. If you want a complete list of games affected by the GameSpy shutdown, I have a link in the description. So what can you do as a consumer? Well, you could protest with your wallet. Stop buying Denuvo covered games like Rise of the Tomb Raider and Doom. If you feel really compelled to say something, email the customer service team over at Bethesda or Square Enix. I mean, no one's actually going to do that, but, the option is there. And there you have it. Not just pirates are affected by DRM.